welcome everybody, all the representatives of European Large Families Associations that are attending this webinar on the European Child Warranty. And I would like also to introduce Regina Maroncelli, who is the president of the European Large Families Confederation, to welcome everybody in this webinar. Good morning, Regina. Buongiorno.
Buongiorno. Thank you, Raul. Thank you, everybody, for being here, especially Mr. Hugh Fraser, who was very kind to accept our invitation in such a short time. We are starting with this webinar, a new initiative of ELFAC with some training webinars about issues that are important for our large families. I greet everybody, especially let me greet our Laszlo Maki, who has been our former president, now is still our honorary president from Hungary, and of course everybody. So thank you for being here. We are today here to learn about this child guarantee, which is something that is kind of a mystery for me. But as I have learned, kind of a mystery for many people, at least in my country. Even politicians seems to not to know what it's all about. But this is why we want to know something about ELFAC. First of all, let me introduce you our association. It is a confederation of large family associations. We gather 26 associations from 23 European countries, and we represent children, families with 3 and more children all over Europe, which is a share of 13% of households altogether. And according to latest statistic, almost 1/3 of children in Europe live with 2 siblings. So maybe we are a small part of households, especially in many countries like Italy, for example, or Spain, those countries where fertility rate is very low. But we provide, let's say, in a bad word, a very big number of children. This is why we want to talk about children and why children are so important for us. I would like first of all, let me remind something else, that we, as a confederation, we not only stand and work for advocacy in public institutions, the European and global level, but we are very proud and keen on the values that are in large families. Values such as sobriety, sharing, solidarity, brotherhood, and soft skills that are very valuable for societies, such as being able of team working, of sharing, of patience, and so on. So we consider our model a family model that deserve to be preserved and valued, not only because it needs, because sometimes, and we will talk about this, we need, but because it's valuable for society. But I would like Raul, please, to show a short video that was published by the Commission, the European Commission, about recent studies on demography. as you probably noticed, being a video about demography, there was no mentioning of children, which I find quite strange. No mentioning of the birth rates, which in Europe are very low, as you know. It's about 155, which about the age of birth, first age 30.8 for women, and I think this is very serious because if you don't consider children in planning the future of a country, you really forget the future. So the child guarantee should be a guarantee that the children's future and our own future will be preserved, or at least this is my hope. And I hope that Mr. Fraser will teach us how to use this new tool that the European Commission, not only for large families, but for every child in Europe. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Regina. Before the presentation of the Professor Fraser, I would like to give the floor to Kinga Jo. Kinga Jo is not also a mother of large family. She's the Vice President of the Hungarian Large Families Association, and she's also a member of the European Economic and Social Committee in Brussels. Good morning, Jó napot kívánok, Kinga.
Hello, good morning to all. Jó napot in Hungarian. It is my pleasure to welcome you all. I hope you can hear me well. I will try to speak slowly. And thank you very much for this occasion to share some of my thoughts and my impressions regarding the child guarantee. And maybe also to highlight some of the points, as Regina said, that are not altogether clear or needs a little bit more explanation, at least for me. But to start with, I would like to say that, of course, it is welcome, this initiative for the child guarantee scheme, as it is a very important step in the EU to help children and hopefully also to help their families in not only reducing but eradicating or completely eliminating poverty and risk of poverty. As the feasibility study points out, there were some improvements in fighting child poverty in the European Union in the last couple of years, but these improvements were not very significant. So this is evidently a need for action. I'd also like to raise the attention to the fact that the situation during this era of pandemic will probably worsen, and the improvements are in danger regarding the fight against child and family poverty. Therefore, I think it is not only very timely, but it is very urgent to act with the help of this scheme. A little bit about my double role that most of the participants are very familiar with, but I think it is always nice to mention the background where somebody is coming from, to see that the viewpoints are rooted in these backgrounds. So as it was said by Raul, as I was introduced, I am the Vice President of the Hungarian National Association for Large Families, which is one of the largest in Europe, but also in Hungary. This is the second largest civil society organization in terms of membership, with 16,000 member families, meaning around 70,000 individuals, children and parents, grandparents. Now, about the percentage of large families, Regina pointed out very well that we are not the majority. In Hungary, for example, large families make up around 10% of all families. But the ratio of children raised in large families is quite high. At least I know the data for Hungary. And every third child under the age of 15 is raised in a large family, in a household with 3 or more children. So I think this is quite important to keep in mind. I would also like to point out that through this approach, and because I am vice president of NOA, this large families association, that I think an integrative approach on child poverty is important, and to recall that child poverty is first and foremost a matter of family poverty. And to break the cycle of poverty, it is maybe not enough to provide all those that are foreseen in the feasibility study that are very, very important, as free education, free healthcare, and so on. But actions are also needed that are targeting the family as a whole. Just a very short example about Hungary, where we already have some good provisions for children in need, but we always see that those children who get free meals, free textbooks in schools, when they go home, and if their parents are not active in the labor market, or if they have a very bad health condition, it can again put them back into this cycle, into this vicious cycle of poverty and of vulnerability. So investing in the family is the most efficient way to help vulnerable children, in my thinking, I wanted to point out. Also, what I missed a little bit in the feasibility study is the generational approach. The 2 or more generations that ensure that both children and family receive support, because especially in cases of vulnerable families in Hungary, these can be communities in the Roma ethnicity. We see that generations are very close to one another, because women give birth to their children at quite an early age. So, for example, a program that is financed through the operational program of the European Union, it's called Family and Career Program. NOA is also taking part in this. And I had the personal experience to take part in one of their trainings and to see a grandmother in her early 50s, together with her daughter in her early 30s, coming with her daughter, the granddaughter, in around 20 years old, taking part in this career program, while also the grandchild, the children were there, because this program offers childcare and child supervision, while the parents, grandparents and great-grandparents are taking part of this program. I just have to switch on, sorry for this technical, it's just a moment. I forgot to plug my computer, sorry. But now it's okay. So even 4 generations, of course, this is exceptional case, but I think this needs to be taken into account. And what Regina said, that all families become more vulnerable when they have children, and even more in this context of pandemic, this should be very much taken into account. Now, I would like to speak a little bit about the roadmap that I am familiar with on the child guarantee, and maybe Mr. Fraser can have some additions on that. I think it is important for us to know what is coming up. So the European Commission is currently finalizing the preparatory works related to the future proposal for a Council recommendation on a child guarantee. It is foreseen in 2021. Member States at this very moment are asked by the Social Protection Committee to provide data and information on the size of children in need population across the Member States, as well as providing information on existing policy measures implemented at national level. Also, there will be consultation towards the two advisory bodies, one which I am member of, the Economic and Social Committee and the Committee of Regions. There is, of course, the public consultation that is ongoing and that is running until the 7th of October, and it is open to individuals as well as to organizations to express their views. And my very last point to conclude my intervention is a little bit of attention raising also to our work in the Economic and Social Committee. Just today, we are discussing the European Social Fund Plus opinion, the amended European Social Plus program. And I would just like to read a call regarding the child guarantee, that it should be also included in this program. So my committee, as I said, it reiterates the call that it was also expressed by the European Parliament, that in addition, depending on the actual situation in a specific territory, it should be possible to allocate more than 5% of funds to combat child poverty as part of the funds for social inclusion. In this regard, measures to tackle child poverty should be carried out taking into account the feasibility study for a child guarantee. So I hope that with this I somehow contributed to our discussion today, and I'm very much looking forward to the presentation of Mr. Fraser, and I would like also to thank him for his availability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kinga. Then I'd like to introduce you, Professor Hugh Fraser. He's one of the coordinators of the study of feasibility study of the European Child Guarantee. We are very grateful because he accepted very quick our invitation to talk to us about this proposal, this initiative in only a few days. Then thank you very much. And Hugh Fraser grew up in Northern Ireland, but moved to Dublin in 1987, where he now lives and has a studio. He has got a long interest in painting, and also a diploma in the history of European painting from Trinity College Dublin. He took up painting in his 30s and studied at extramural classes at the College Art in Belfast and the National College of Art and Design in Dublin. He currently combines a growing career as a painter with his profession as an expert on combating poverty and social exclusion. He's a former director of both the Northern Ireland Voluntary Trust and the Irish Government's Combat Poverty Agency. For 5 years, he was an expert on social inclusion policy at the European Commission in Brussels. He's currently adjunct professor at Maynooth University and coordinator of the European Commission's European Social Policy Network. He lived in Brussels from 2001 and 2006 and still has a studio apartment head there. He's married and he's a father of large families with 3 sons. Thank you very much, Professor Fraser, to be with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Roel, can you put up my PowerPoint? Well, that is hopefully going up. It's very good to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation to join you. I think this is a very timely webinar. I think the proposed child guarantee, and it is still a work that's been developed by the European Commission, but I think it's potentially an important development in terms of issues of child poverty And there is a real opportunity, I think, to influence the final shape it will take. But also, I think it's important now to prepare for when it arrives so that you can make the maximum use of it in different countries and use it as a lever to improve actions and policies at member state level and indeed at more local level. My input is basically going to explain a bit more about, I mean, Kinga has already done it a little bit, but to explain a bit more about the origins of the child guarantee and the sort of context into which it is coming and what has happened so far in terms of developing it, and maybe then what are a few of the issues that maybe need to be teased out a bit more in the future. So could we have the next slide? So this is just to state the ambition, and this is where the child guarantee came from. It was the European Parliament calling for every child in Europe at risk of poverty, including refugee children, has access to free healthcare, free education, free childcare, decent housing, and adequate nutrition. So it is a big ambition. Next slide. So the origins of this go back to 2015, when the Parliament were developing a report on inequalities, but within that on a special focus on child poverty. And that's where this call for a child guarantee was first put out. And the reasons for this were essentially, I think, two main reasons. First of all, we went back to 2013 when the Commission did have a very good recommendation on investing in children breaking the cycle of disadvantage and had a three pillar approach based on children's rights. And that had some impact, but there were various studies, I was involved in one of them, that assessed the impact across Europe. And it was less, I think, than most of us hoped for. And when the Parliament started to look at the issue, they felt that there hadn't been as much implementation as had been hoped for. And also particularly, one of the things that 2013 recommendation had stressed using EU funds to support member states in developing policies to tackle child poverty. And there wasn't very much evidence that had made much impact on the use of EU funds in favor of families and children. And then I think more generally, the data on child poverty and social exclusion had shown relatively small improvements and certainly not on the scale that had been envisaged. As a result of this, the call, there was a sort of debate between the Parliament and the Commission about the idea of a child guarantee. And eventually in 2017, it was agreed in the budget that there will be a preparatory action, which is a way of looking at a new policy development. And this was agreed between the Commission and the Parliament. And this would be 3 phases. First of all, a big feasibility study. Second, a study on economic implementing framework. And thirdly, a number of pilot projects to test out some of the ideas emerging. I think it is fair to say that the Commission were fairly skeptical about the need for a child guarantee at this stage. And it was a fairly small number of people in the Commission who were paying much attention to it at all. But so the idea of a preparatory action was a bit of a compromise to look at things, but not necessarily have to commit to them. Things began to change. I think one thing that was really significant was the European Pillar of Social Rights, which had sort of said a shift to more emphasis in Europe on social policy. And within that, I think particularly important was Principle 11, which specifically referred to children having the right to protection from poverty. And this became sort of raised everything up on the political agenda. And there was a shift generally on social policy in Europe. So it meant that actually what was beginning on the child guarantee was beginning to happen in a more positive policy climate. I think then the other thing that was really important was the negotiations on structural funds from 2021 to 2027. And I know Kinga has mentioned this, but certainly the Parliament had sort of immediately demanded a very significant allocation to be made to a child guarantee as part of their negotiating position. I think they called in 2018 for 5.9 billion to be allocated in support. And indeed, I think it's fair to say that in some ways, the starting point for the child guarantee was to get more EU funds to support children. It's broadened out from then to looking at policy with funds in support of policy. There was then a very big change in 2019 in the political framework, and that was the incoming European Commission, and particularly the incoming president, when she presented her case for becoming president, Ursula von der Leyen, to the Parliament. She said she would, to support every child in need, I will create the European Child Guarantee, picking up an idea proposed by the European Parliament. And when she became president, she followed through on this. She allocated specific responsibility to Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights, Nicholas Schmidt, to develop the child guarantee. And she also gave to one of the vice presidents for democracy and demography an overall coordinating role across the whole commission. So recognizing that children's issues were broader than just any one particular policy area, but needed to cut across a range of policy areas. And that really was a major change. Having started to work at that stage on the phase one of the sort of study for the commission, suddenly, instead of having one relatively junior official turning up and expressing that we had to be very skeptical about the need for this, suddenly lots of officials started turning up at meetings and got much more infused, and we stopped being told we had to be skeptical about the need for a child guarantee because it had become a political commitment and a political priority. And I think that's why, in a sense, this discussion is really important, because with the president having committed herself to this and working on it, it is something I think will happen, even if the form is not entirely clear. Okay, next slide, please. So just to give you a bit about the feasibility study for phase one, which we looked at from 2018 until I think the final report was about June this year that we finally produced. And there were lots of other reports. We were specifically asked, the Commission asked us not just to look at all children in poverty, but to look at 4 target groups: children in institutions, children with disabilities, children with a migrant background, and children living in precarious families. So it was a very specific sort of remit. It wasn't necessarily every group that could benefit, because in a sense the Parliament had called for all children experiencing poverty. We've produced an awful lot of reports, country reports. We had then 5 policy papers on each of the different policy areas, the 5 policy areas that the Parliament had highlighted. We had target group discussion papers based on pulling together all of that information for the different groups we were asked to look at. There was a major online consultation with stakeholders. We had 8 case studies looking at lessons from international funding programs benefiting children. We had 4 consultations with children. We then had 4 major fact-finding workshops on each group where we consulted with practitioners in the field. That led to a big intermediate report, which was then discussed in the findings at a final conference, which led to the final report. So there's been an awful lot of information collected, and I'd say it's quite a useful resource. Some of those reports are really very interesting and very good bibliographies. So there's 286 pages if you want to read all the final report, but you can actually dip into bits that interest you, and that can take you on to other things. So I'd say it's potentially a useful resource, whatever else it is. Hopefully it becomes more than just a resource. Okay, next slide. I'm not going to go through everything in that report, it would take hours, but I just thought I'd summarize the main findings or conclusions that we reached. I think there's 15 of them. The first is that access by children in vulnerable situations to the 5 policy areas identified by the European Parliament needs to be improved. There is an issue that lots of children in vulnerable situations do not have access to the 5 policy areas. And we found clearly the extent of this problem varies from country to country, but all countries have problems for some children, for some policy areas. So it's a cross-European issue. We certainly highlighted that the access to the 5 policy areas, or not having access to the 5 policy areas under question, has short and long-term negative consequences for children, but also for the wider society. I think it was a starting point, and it actually goes back to the 2013 Commission recommendation about the link to children's rights. But what we established clearly from looking at international frameworks for children's rights, and indeed European frameworks, that the lack of access to the 5 policy areas represents a failure to uphold children's rights. And there's quite a lot about the legal background to all that in the report. Then the next question, because this is one the Commission had been saying, well, is it possible to guarantee that children could have access to these 5 policy areas? And what we found, lots of examples where they do have access, countries that have good policies, and if you put the right supports and the right policies and frameworks in place, it is possible to ensure that children do have access. So it's possible to make initiatives that will meet the ambitions that the Parliament set out. One of the sort of broad conclusions we reached was why we were asked to look at specific target groups. We felt that the evidence was that access to the 5 policy areas, there's a need to focus on all children in vulnerable situations. One shouldn't be sort of discriminating on particular groups, but you say we should recognize this is a right for all children who are experiencing poverty or at risk of poverty. Next slide. What we did find was that universal policies that ensure access for all children are very important, but for children who have particular difficulties or particular barriers to overcome to access services, you need a twin-track approach where you might need additional things for some children or for some groups or for some families to support their access to services in addition to having good universal services. But we also find that ensuring access isn't enough. The services need to be inclusive services, they need to be of high quality, and they need to ensure that children don't experience stigma or segregation in accessing those. So a lot of evidence came from practitioners about the importance of developing and how you develop inclusive services and ensure that services for all children are of high quality. In terms of poverty and social exclusion, we did conclude that while access to the 5 policy areas identified by the Parliament is very important in tackling child poverty and social exclusion, it is not sufficient. It doesn't cover other important policy areas like ensuring adequate income to families, tackling issues of discrimination, maybe transport policy could be important to be able to access services. There are lots of other policy areas that are also important if you're going to be successful in tackling poverty. A key issue I think that came across quite a lot was it's not enough to look at just one issue. Access to education doesn't just depend on improving your education. It also ensures that people have income, that their children have access to good health. All those things interact. So you need to have, in member states, a comprehensive approach to tackling issues around child poverty and look at interconnections and how services can reinforce each other. The question that often came up to the Commission, well, really this is something for member states and it's not something that we should be dealing with at European level. What we established very clearly from looking at the legal basis for action in relation to children is, and there's a very good section written by an expert on the sort of legal rights in this area, there's primary responsibility clearly rests with member states for ensuring access to the 5 policy areas. But there is a legal basis for EU action to support member states in terms of policy coordination and guidance and financial support. And this is both feasible, there are things that the Commission can do, and it has a clear legal base. So there is a legal base to establish a child guarantee at European level in support of member states. Next finding, or next slide, sorry. One of the things we looked at was what was already in place, both in terms of structural funds, the Commission recommendation, various other initiatives have taken place in relation to particular groups, particularly, for example, in relation to children in institutions. And we discovered that these were useful and they had, in some cases, encouraged member states to do more and supported them. But we also discovered that there was much more that could be done at European level to add real value to the efforts of member states. And there could be a more effective use of the existing instruments that the EU had to support member states, and particularly in terms of funds. And that takes us to the next finding, was that really there was potential to play a lot more positive role using EU funds in support of children and our families. And there's a lot in the report, detailed look at what has happened. And one of the rather disconcerting things was we found it very hard to get any information out of the Commission on the amount of resources that were spent out of EU funds on children. There just wasn't an area that data was really collected or organized in a very specific way. And while we were able to find a lot of good examples where some countries, perhaps at local level, had used funds very effectively and some very important initiatives, in general, we found that there wasn't a very systematic approach to this, and much more could be done to focus better on children in poverty in the use of EU funds. We did see that EU political leadership is important in encouraging member states. I mean, looking at other policy areas where there's been developments, by taking an initiative, even if main responsibility remains with member states, when the European Council decides something is a priority that is shared across Europe and keeps looking at it and keeps it to the fore, that really does encourage member states to do more. And this was definitely one of those areas that we saw significant potential for more EU political leadership. We also highlighted the need for the EU to look across the different components and the European Commission to look across different Directorate Generals because of child poverty being an issue to cut across. And that's why we were so pleased to see that there is a Vice President has been given a coordinating role in this regard. And then I think the final thing to say in terms of findings was that there was considerable popular and political demand for a child guarantee. We've seen that from the Parliament. We've heard about the European Economic and Social Committee. We've seen it from individual member states. And it certainly came across very strongly from the evidence from the online consultation that we had as part of the feasibility study. The next slide. At the end of the report, we teased out a range of issues that needed to be developed further in the development. And I think there were 9 main issues, and they were debated a lot at the final conference. I just wanted to highlight 4 of them because I think they perhaps begin to suggest the area or direction that the child guarantee might go in or need to resolve. And I think one of the questions that came up is, it's great to have a Commission recommendation or a Council recommendation, which is higher status, but how do we ensure it actually has an impact beyond being a nice thing and a good thing and aspirational? And the fear was that by just having a broad aspiration, a bit like the original Parliament's ambition, is a nice thing, but it's a bit vague in terms of what actually member states will have to do because of it. And that makes it difficult to hold them accountable. So people were suggesting that what you need to do is to also identify some very specific and tangible policy levers in the different policy areas to achieve the overall desired outcomes, and that you could use those to see where member states delivering on them or not delivering, and they would be very specific and tangible and people would understand them. But at the same time, people were also saying we still need to have the idea of a comprehensive strategy. So I think the challenge in designing the child guarantee is to balance having that overall vision, that overall need for a comprehensive approach on child poverty, but also then having some very specific things that people are encouraged to make sure are happening in their countries. I think a second issue that's come up a bit has been, what children should be covered. All children in poverty, target groups that we've been asked to look at, children in need more generally, children in low-income families. Obviously, in your case, you'll be talking about children in large families, but how will that be defined in the guarantee? How broad or how narrow? And I think that's still not entirely a resolved issue. The third issue I think that's worth thinking about is how broad should be. The Parliament identified 5 areas. In fact, as I'll cover in a moment, the Commission in its consultation has now added a 6th policy area to this, because that takes you on to the question is, how do you link to overall strategies to tackle child poverty? There are some issues that are not covered in the Parliament's ambitions at all. Particularly, I think the income one is a big one, and income also relates access to work for parents being crucial in that regard, as well as income support. And then the other big issue that keeps coming up all the time is how to increase the use of EU funds, but particularly how to use them in a way that they act as levers or triggers for better policies and more funds being generated at national levels. Because the reality is, even if you have a significant allocation from EU funds, it will only be a small bit of what is needed to ensure adequate services that children from disadvantaged backgrounds can access. And that is why the proposals, and we heard about the 5% has now been proposed, I think, by the Commission and the Parliament to allocate for supporting the guarantee. And that's still up for debate, and member states need to be encouraged, and it'll be a key challenge, I think, ensuring that happens. Okay, next issue. I'll skip through this very quickly, but we're now into the second phase of the feasibility study. It has a very exciting title, as you can see there, about the economic implementing framework of a possible EU child guarantee scheme, including its financial foundation. But essentially, we've been asked to look more specifically at some of the costs of implementing policies, but then secondly, to look at how that might be structured, how it might be delivered, who is responsible. But more particularly, we've been asked, if I could have the next slide, to focus very specifically on a few of the policy levers. Can we go to the next slide? Yes, actually the first one should say not access to free health, but access to nutrition. But looking at the areas, we've been asked to identify, based on the first study, a specific development in that policy area. And in terms of nutrition, it's each child at risk of poverty should receive at least one healthy, balanced, full meal per day. And then we've been asked to look at what individual countries are doing to ensure that, and what good practices on that. On access to free early childhood education and care, the general component is each child at risk of poverty should have access to free ECE services. And then we're looking at the policies that the member states have in place to ensure that. On access to decent housing, we're looking at there should be no homeless children. So we're looking at what policies are in place to stop homelessness amongst families with children. And on access to free education, we're looking specifically at the issue of school costs. So there should be no school costs for children at risk of poverty attending compulsory school. And we're looking at policies that are in place in relation to that. In relation to free health services, each child at risk of poverty should be provided with free regular examination and follow-up treatment of their successive growth stages. And again, we're looking at what policies and programs countries have in place in that regard. And then in addition to those 5 areas, we were also asked by the Commission to look at how good examples of integrated service, where the different policies and the different policy areas are perhaps coordinated, so people have an interaction between the different policies in support of children. And we're looking at all of those in some detail, and initially from country studies, we're then identifying what seem to be some of the best policies across Europe. And then we're doing some costings of those and saying what would be needed for that to be rolled out in different countries and what costs would be involved. So they're very concrete areas. They were selected on the basis of some of the findings and from what the Commission was saying to us. They're certainly not all the policy areas that need to be covered or could be covered by a child guarantee, but they're ones that seem to have emerged as being particularly important, or where there are big gaps in several countries. Okay, next slide, please. Just to say a word about the Commission roadmap and consultation, and Kinga mentioned this, but it is a real opportunity. There's a consultation since the 19th of August, and you have until the 7th of October. And it's interesting, some of the things, the Commission gives a lot of background, but there are some interesting bits in it. I think it says clearly that the aim is a Council recommendation in early 2021. It adds an additional policy area, culture and leisure activities, access to culture and leisure activities, which interestingly was in the original Commission recommendation in 2013. It talks about a focus on children in need as opposed to children in poverty or particular target groups. It does very importantly, I think, make a link to the consequences of COVID-19. And I think that's really important given the impact of COVID-19 on children and on children's development. It highlights that, and this is particularly in the context of EU funds, that member states will be encouraged to adopt multi-annual national strategies up to 2030, and then spell out how those will be implemented through Child Guarantee National Action Plan. So those are very important things, and will maybe become a condition within EU funding in this area in the future in terms of social inclusion. And I'd say that the main emphasis you get from the Commission roadmap is, I think they're trying to put a lot of focus on how a guarantee would be implemented to have an impact. And I think that is encouraging. Next slide. So just in conclusion, I've talked probably far too long. I think there are some challenges in ensuring an effective child guarantee. I mean, I think there is a key challenge is to keep it on the agenda at a time of COVID and indeed, well, I'm coming from Ireland, of Brexit. But those are very big political priorities, and we don't want to risk children losing out on that. And we keep having to say children will be particularly badly affected by these things, so it makes the guarantee even more important. And I think that's an important message that needs to be highlighted. There is a challenge of balancing the comprehensive strategic vision with some very concrete things that member states can be held to, so that we actually ensure something gets delivered because of the guarantee. And then I think that there is a task to be done by people like yourselves in trying to pressurize their member states to support the proposal from the Commission for a Council recommendation and to support the proposals to allocate significant amount of EU funding in support of children in the coming period. Then I think there are opportunities for stakeholders to use the child guarantee that you need to be thinking about now, even though it isn't in its final form. You need to be thinking how you can use it to encourage your member states to develop comprehensive and long-term strategies to combat child and family poverty. You need to ensure, I think, better identification by member states of the key barriers in your countries at national level, but also at sub-national level, to children having access to the services. But also you need to look at how perhaps you can trigger more national and sub-national levels of funding to overcome those barriers. And then I think there will be an important role for stakeholders to ensure and contribute to regular monitoring and reporting on progress on implementation. Because generally, in my experience of EU things, it's the monitoring and reporting that highlights what is or isn't being done, and making that visible is what makes it have an impact on policy and actions at local level ultimately. So good luck.
Thank you very much, Professor Fraser. I think that has been very interesting for us because we have had a complete view of what is European Child Guarantee, the process of the Child Guarantee, and what could be the role of the associations in this process, because we need to send our opinion, and I think it's very important, this link between children and family poverty. It's not only child poverty, it's also family poverty, and large families. Yes, we are a very important part of the house in Europe, and also the difficulties are also different than other types of families. I don't know if someone of you, of the attendants, we are attendants from 13 European countries. That's incredible. We are from Portugal, Spain, France, Latvia, Germany, Romania, Hungary, Croatia, Italy, Poland, Belgium, Greece, and of course, Ireland. Then I don't know, Regina, if you want to say something.
Yes, please. Yes, please. Thank you, Mr. Fraser. Now this object is not so difficult to understand, but I have several comments. As large families, we don't like to be defined as vulnerable families, because we consider ourselves a normal kind of family, a normal, let's say, normal model. On the other hand, it is true that having a child, even only a child, exposes a couple to a risk of poverty. And this is something that retains many young people to have children or to postpone their birth. I was wondering if the child guarantee could work not only as a recovery of poverty, but also as a preventing poverty, child poverty, in order to give more serenity to young people looking forward to having a family? This is a question. And another question is about, for example, the Polish association tell us that each child there has the right to have something like 120 euros per month till the age of 18, I think. Do you think that such a simple measure that is so successful in Poland, where it has reduced to very low rates child poverty, could be possible at an European level? Thank you.
Shall I deal with that? Yes. I mean, I think the first one is a very important point. Well, I take the general point, clearly not all about vulnerability. I mean, I think it is fair to say that the evidence shows that large families tend to be at a higher risk of poverty than quite a few others. But not all large families, and indeed very often, even if that risk of poverty, the large family may be very supportive. So that's clearly a case. But I do think that for a lot, because large families are one of the groups that could take advantage of this because of the high risk of poverty evidence, one should be aware of the potential of the support. In terms of prevention, yes, I mean, I think that's a key bit, is that clearly trying to ensure that there are sufficient supports in place, that people are actually not falling into poverty, or and then all the consequences of that. And a big theme that came out in the feasibility study was the importance of very early intervention to support children and their families, and that would be absolutely key in preventing a lot of other things down the road. So I think prevention and creating a secure family environment is clearly a key importance to reducing child poverty around Europe. I think your point from Poland is about income support. And I mean, one of the things that we would have highlighted a lot, I think, in our final report was that what was missing, in a sense, from what we were looking at was the concern about the income support. And family income support is clearly been a major factor in a lot of countries in reducing actual levels of poverty, and is a key part of any package. And that's why we were saying very clearly, of course, it would be a big advantage if you can improve the access, particularly of children who are in need, or children who are experiencing poverty, to ensure that they do have access to these essential services. You can't avoid also looking at the income strand and ensuring that there are proper income supports. Now, clearly part of income support is supports to families in terms of employment, but that also then takes you into areas like childcare as well. So I think the income strand is really important. I'm not sure it's going to be addressed in the child guarantee, but I think what it may be addressed is if people have to produce overall national strategies and plans within which they then look at the access to services.
Thank you very much. If one of you have any other question. Okay, then I think we are arriving to the time to finish this webinar. For me, it has been really interesting to know better this initiative. I think it would be very useful for us that Europe will be able to listen the voice of European large families, because I think in all the countries we have practically the same problems, and I think it's important to know the specificities of our families. And thank you very much. And I don't know, Regina, if you want to say some words to finish this webinar as a president of the European Corporation.
I see we have a question. Yes. I see we have a question from Portugal. I don't know if we have a couple of minutes to. I see it on the chat. All the policies exists in Portugal, but the problem that I would say the key issues is the criteria used to include or exclude children and families. Considering that each child only needs 0.3 of one adult, is disconcerting child a lot. Shouldn't we defend that each child values one? Yes, that is each child value. That is could be our motto, actually.
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure that's a question for me to answer. It's probably a question for you to answer what you think it should be. But I think it'll become, I doubt that the Commission will define exactly in each country who they say children in need are. I think that will probably be delegated back down to the national level, but there will be a lot of exchange on this. And actually, I think the Social Protection Committee, I think Kinga mentioned this, are looking at data and things. And some of the colleagues I work with have worked a lot on how you decide to measure children in need and what weighting you put in data. I'm not the expert on that. My colleague Eric Marlier and Catherine Guillot are real experts on what is the appropriate weighting in measurement that gives you child poverty and things. But I think what you actually find is, and it's one of the difficulties we're finding in the phase 2 study, when we were specifically asked to look at children and poverty, actually for access to a lot of the services, it's not based on the European children and poverty measure. It's based on national determinations of what is a level of need that gives you free access or entitles you to extra services or things. So it does vary a lot around, and there isn't a very tangible. But I think one of the things that might come out of all of this is a bit more debate about what is appropriate. And that might happen at European level, but that might then be used to influence what happens at national level. So you sort of have to use these European things in ways that can enhance your own national debates, but they very rarely tell you the complete answer.
Okay, thank you very much.
And I think, sorry, Raul, I think we could stress the fact that we would like not only tackle poverty, but support children well-being, child well-being, which of course is part of the problem altogether. I mean, it would help us seeing the problem in a more structural and more comprehensive way. Children and then families as well. So I really let me thank you once again for being here and explaining us what this was all about. We will try to make treasure of this knowledge and try to work for a better Europe that starts with our children. Thank you.
Thank you, and now good evening for everybody. It's 12, it's the time to finish. Thank you very much, Professor Fraser. Thank you very much. The attendance from 13 European countries that will be present, has been present in this meeting, and next time we'll meet again. Goodbye.